Hi, so this is my first sort of gear review since taking both my news and Fountain Pictures channels public in June of 2018. I had done a couple reviews of my laptop, my Dell XPS 13, which I gave a good review, then had maintenance issues with resulting in 2 or 3 rants following that review. And I reviewed my phone once, but this is my first time reviewing a camera and for a broader audience. So let's get into my review of the Sony a7 III, my new camera and my new favorite camera. So now I know that not everyone in the audience is, an aspiring filmmaker as I am. This channel that I'm publishing it to, the Fountain Pictures channel, attracts mostly the, at the moment, football and lacrosse audience. So I'm going to, I don't mean any offense when I say this, but I am going to try to explain things in a way that makes sense to most people so that instead of me just spitting out jargon like 100 megabits per second and 120 FPS, so I'm going to try to explain these concepts and why they're important to me and my workflow. And first is why I upgraded and what I upgraded from. So I upgraded from my Canon Rebel SL1, or as most of the world knows it, the 100D, because for some reason Canon feels the need to rebrand their products, or at least their entry-level products for the North American market as Rebel. I don't know why. This was a great camera. I loved shooting with it. It was my learner camera. It's where I learned how to do everything I know how to do today was with this. But the video quality has never really blown me away, and it was starting to increasingly underwhelm me as I continue to watch more and more YouTube videos, and all the other YouTubers I watch upgrade their camera systems. And so my eyes started wandering to a bunch of different cameras in the Sony lineup, and from Nikon and Canon as well, and Panasonic. And I ultimately decided on the Sony a7 III just because it had superior video quality. So let's get right into it. So I feel like a great place to start is going to be with the body of the Sony a7 III. Now, the body of my Canon was not bad, but it's well assembled. The issue is it's very small, which it was actually the smallest DSLR in the world at the time of launch, and I believe it still is, which is cool in a way, but I honestly didn't need the smallest camera ever, and that comes with some definite drawbacks. The grip is not really big enough. As you can see, there's you can see light. I can look through it like a telescope, in the space between my fingers and the actual grip, so it's not very ergonomic to hold. And the plastic, I didn't have an issue with the plastic really, but compared to the Sony, which is a magnesium alloy body, it definitely feels lighter, cheap, almost like a toy at this point. But yeah, the body, it's really well made. Both cameras are, but the metal definitely is a big step up. It feels much more solid in the hand, and it is also weatherproof, so it can get rain, dust, debris on it. The lenses I have are not, so I usually use a wet bag when I'm filming in the rain, but that's more on that in a moment. But the other great things about the body, besides it being well assembled, is the customization that is enabled by the different buttons. Now, the buttons, they feel decent in different areas. This is definitely a very niche, sort of nerdy complaint. Although I do think that the menu and custom buttons 3 and 4 feel a little bit rubbery, spongy, plasticky. They feel a little bit cheap, but the rest of the buttons for me, and the knobs and dials as well, all feel very solidly built. And what I love about it is there's a ton of customization. There's like 2 different dials on it, and then there's a third sort of menu dial. And I can configure those to be whatever I want. It has 4 custom buttons that do nothing out of the box, so you can configure to be whatever you want. And I love being able to take advantage of these features because they really, when you start using them, they really help speed up your workflow. Just to be able to, if you need to adjust some settings really quickly, having it set up for the way you want to work is definitely ideal. And this camera, my old camera, did not have a ton of those features. It's sort of like, it wasn't a pain to use. It wasn't too slow for me to program the settings in I wanted, but it was just, it wasn't nearly as customizable as the Sony is. And the Sony, for port selection, it's quite good as well. It's a little bit better than this. The biggest difference being it has a headphone jack. This does not. But yeah, so I can actually listen to the video I'm recording, I can hear the audio in real time, or I can listen to the videos I just recorded, playing them back through the camera using headphones, because internal speakers on cameras are they're not good and they're not very loud. So being able to plug headphones in is definitely helpful. In addition to that, it has a microphone input for the boom mic I have above me, which is XLR adapted to 3.5mm jack, which is what the camera has, which is what you're gonna have to do with any mirrorless camera if you plan on doing like primary system sound, period. But in addition to that, it also has an micro HDMI port, which some people complain about being fragile. I haven't really had an issue with it. In addition to that, it also has a USB Type-C port for transferring files and charging the camera, although the battery is removable. More on that in a moment. And then finally, it has a micro B port, which serves the same purpose as the Type-C port. In addition to that, it has dual SD card readers, which is great for redundancy, so that, SD cards, they don't fail often, but they do fail, and it's great to be able to have a backup recording of your video, especially for if you're using this camera for any sort of work where you're making a profit with deadlines, where you're working with a client. You definitely do not want to lose that footage, and having redundancy, being able to record the video to 2 cards at once simultaneously is great. In addition to that, you can also configure it instead to where once you fill up one card, it transitions to the second one, so you can either double your redundancy or double your amount of storage. So that's a great feature to have. And then finally is the battery. It is removable, which I would expect in either this camera or that one, especially at the price point of that camera, but of the Sony. And the battery, it is fantastic. It's the new Sony Z series battery, which they have used in the R3, the R4 that just came out, the just 3, like this one, and then the A9. It's significantly larger than previous Sony batteries, which Sony cameras kind of had a bad rap for not having great battery life. This battery is awesome. I can get about 2.5 hours of video on a single battery, which is awesome, because especially my sort of benchmark is, can I make it through a single football game, or even just, can I make it to halftime, honestly, on a single charge? Because with my Canon, I've changed it about every quarter for a football game, which is a pain, because despite football is kind of slow in terms of transitioning between each quarter, I still don't have enough time to get the battery out, get it in, plop it back onto a shoulder rig or a gimbal or a tripod. That's a huge pain in the butt. So having more battery life like the Sony does is definitely beneficial for my work. So overall, the body of the camera, it's great. I also kind of like the design of it personally, which is totally a subjective thing. It's like a pseudo retro modern hybrid. It kind of looks like a camera from the 1960s, 1980s, like a film camera, because it's kind of square in a cool way. So I kind of like that. It's a more unique looking than this Canon, which Canon and Nikons are just they're all like these rounded, aerodynamic looking, chunky things. So I kind of like the design of the Sony. The EVF and the screen. Now the screen does not flip all the way around. It's not a one where you can flip it out the side and look at yourself while you're filming, which I don't have a big issue with, but many vloggers will have an issue with that. My sort of rebuttal to that, though, is if you're a vlogger, you should be looking into the lens like I am. You shouldn't be looking at the screen the entire time you're filming. It's unprofessional. It's amateur. Despite the fact that vlogging is already kind of unprofessional, but it makes you look like an amateur vlogger as opposed to a vlogger who knows what they're doing. So it's not an issue for me, and I don't think it should be an issue for vloggers, despite it being an issue for some reason. And when I actually need to be able to see myself, I'm usually in a studio environment anyway, like this, where I already have probably a TV or a monitor on hand. That's actually probably out of frame, but there's a monitor over there, and I have that stuff already set up to plug into the HDMI port. So for me, that's not really an issue. And then the EVF, as compared to my Canon Rebel SL1, which is a DSLR, this is a mirrorless camera, the Sony. And the EVF versus the OVF, or electronic viewfinder and optical viewfinder, the difference is in the Canon, I'll turn it on for you. There's a mirror assembly here, so the way you see through the viewfinder is light hits the mirror, it bounces up, hits a second mirror, and then into the viewfinder, or into your eye, rather. And this, it represents life the most like your eye sees it. And it's very much up for debate still whether an OVF or an EVF is ideal for photography, but for videography, an OVF is pretty much useless, because if I switch to video mode, and then here I'll flip it up, see, in order to take a photo or take a video, the sensor needs to be exposed to the light. So the light is traveling directly into the sensor. The problem is you can no longer use the viewfinder when the mirror has been flipped up out of the way. so it goes black. Therefore, this is useless for shooting video, and it does have blackout time in photo mode, so it just flickers black as the mirror goes up and back down to expose the sensor really quickly. Now, with an electronic viewfinder and a mirrorless camera, it's literally just basically a second screen inside the viewfinder with some fancy optics in front of it to make it work with your eyeballs from a close distance. And so for me, for a video shooter, that's much better because I can actually use it, and especially outside when the screens when it's too bright to be able to see the screen, or if you're wearing polarized sunglasses, this helps a lot. You still should probably take your polarized sunglasses off, but it helps to sort of block the light out because it's a controlled environment inside the viewfinder. So I definitely have enjoyed having that ability as a step up from this camera. Overall, that's pretty much it for the body though. Now for the lenses, so most entry-level cameras, like this one, was an entry-level DSLR, come with a kit lens or have the option to get a kit lens for it. Sony considers this a7 III to be an entry-level full-frame camera, which to me is an oxymoron because it's, number one, it's not a cheap camera by any sense, but there is an option to get a kit lens with it. The problem is the kit lens does not get great reviews from what I had seen, so I opted to skip the kit lens, partially because I think it's an f4 28-70 zoom, so you can zoom in and out, like a point and shoot or something. But the problem was, so f4, the aperture, which is how wide open you can make this, essentially the lens go, the wider open, the more shallow depth of field you have. Now that's the amount of distance before like the background gets blurry. So like portrait mode on the iPhone is sort of like this, where you can get the nice blurry background. Now it's garbage on the iPhone, but this is actually natural, not software determining it on a mirrorless camera. So I wanted to get two primes at f1.8 so that I could get those nice blurry backgrounds. So right now I'm shooting on the 50mm f1.8, which is just Sony's one. It doesn't get great reviews either, but mostly they complain the autofocus is slow. I don't really have an issue. My other lens is the Rokinon f2.8 24mm, so that's going to be a wider image. Now, because these are primes, you cannot zoom in, but for me, the trade-off of getting the nice shallow depth of field and having a brighter lens in low light too, when you can open it up wider, is something that I thought was worth it. In addition, Sony, people have complained that they don't have the greatest lens selection in the past. However, it's a newer camera system relative to Nikon's F mount, not the Z mount, which is brand new, but the Nikon F mount and Canon EF mount, which both have been around for about at least 40 years. So there's a wide lens selection for those mounts. However, the Sony system, it's catching up quickly. I think there's a perfectly adequate number of lenses available for it, and frankly, I didn't have any issues looking at it. There's more than enough from Sony directly or from third parties now, like Sigma, Tamron, and Rokinon, like the wide lens I have. So I didn't have an issue with that at all with the ecosystem. And it is important, though, to consider if you're into cameras to look at a camera system that has enough lenses, because like a few years ago when iPhones had way more apps than Android phones, and it was annoying to be on Android and be like, it's missing all these apps I want. It's kind of the same thing with a camera system that's not mature yet and doesn't have enough camera lenses, which actually is going to come back in a moment with some of the other models I considered that were competing with this one. And that's pretty much it for the lenses. And finally, the most important thing about a camera, the reason I bought it, is the video quality. Now this camera shoots 4K at up to 30 FPS with a crop in on the sensor. Now the issue with a crop in on the sensor is one of the big deals between when I upgraded from the Canon to the Sony is the Sony has a full frame sensor. So the actual physical image sensor inside the camera is larger than the one inside this in the Sony is larger than the one in the Canon. That's the size of it. It's about the size of this opening on the Sony. So that's a considerably larger sensor as compared to the one inside the Canon, which is great for a lot of reasons. But when you crop in 4K 30 FPS, you basically you get back to where you started. Now you're on a sensor more like an APS-C size sensor. And the issue on a full frame camera like this, when you do that, it's like zooming in with your lens. So a wide lens becomes not so wide anymore, which is annoying. But personally, I don't like shooting at 30 FPS anyway. I do for the 24/7 news show because it's more of a broadcast standard. But for anything cinematic like the lacrosse and football videos, I now shoot at 24 FPS, which on the Sony is full frame. There is no crop in, which is great. So I love shooting 4K at 24 FPS on this camera. In addition to that, something that I thought was going to be helpful, but I didn't realize how much I'd end up loving it, is the 120 FPS slow motion. Now, effectively, this allows me to slow stuff down to 1/5 the speed it normally happens at, because when I'm editing, as I said, the lacrosse videos are 24 FPS, so it's a 24 FPS timeline, meaning that if I want to put 120 FPS, it means there's 120 individual photos taken per second, as opposed to 24 individual photos taken per second that are run, again, it's per second, so it's so fast that you perceive it as movement. We're essentially tricking our eyes with video. But so with something that fast, what you can do is slow it down. You can stretch it out so that the 120 FPS becomes 24 FPS. And when you do that, you get slower footage. And my last camera only shot at 60 FPS, so I was able to slow it down by about half when I was shooting at 30 FPS, because I used to do that, but I don't like it anymore, as I said previously. But being able to do that, it looks awesome when you watch the lacrosse videos. Anything shot in slow motion, it just looks great. I love the look that you get when you shoot at such a high frame rate and then slow it down in post. It just looks fantastic. Now, what's the difference between 1080p and 4K? It's important to my comparison between my old and new cameras, because this one shoots at 4K, the other one did not. But the difference is 4K is 4 times the resolution of 1080p. So it's 4 times sharper. There's 4 times the number of pixels. It looks better. And it depends on the size display you have. If you can really notice the difference on a laptop, it's not a big deal. But a 65-inch TV, you'll see it. But having the flexibility, it also allows me to digitally zoom in post. I mentioned this a little bit earlier with lenses. Like on your iPhone, you can pinch to zoom. Effectively, I'm doing that in post, except when I have 4K and I'm only delivering it at 2K. You cannot tell the difference when I punch in at up to 200%. There's a limit before you do start to notice the loss in quality, but you can actually zoom in digitally, which is great. And besides that, the dynamic range, which is probably the single biggest factor in why I picked this camera, it has 15 stops of dynamic range. Now, dynamic range, it's effectively the number of levels of light the camera can perceive. So on something with fewer stops of dynamic range, essentially the brightest spots and the darkest spots, there's going to be a bit more like staggering to it. So if you shoot in broad daylight on an iPhone and it's like just sort of this ugly bright white sort of on the person's face where the sun is hitting them, and then it sort of drops down sharply to a more natural lifelike color. Essentially, that's less of an issue on something with more dynamic range. It can register more levels of light, so you get a smoother gradient between the darkest and the lightest spots. You still obviously should use diffusion when you shoot outside between the sun if you're trying to make a movie. Like there's actually diffusion sheet right here just for my light, even my LED panel. But so that's still important, but it definitely makes the camera look much more cinematic, especially when I'm shooting lacrosse, which is, very fast-paced sport. And when you're shooting sports in general, you don't have time to set up diffusion, and you would need to put up a giant sheet over the entire field, which is not practical. So being able to have more dynamic range definitely helps to create a more pleasing image to the eye, especially in conditions where you're kind of running and gunning and you can't really set up a ton of gear to get the most cinematic image like sports video. Besides that, the Sony also has a variety of picture profiles. Now what these are, they give you more flexibility again in post, with both dynamic range capturing more of like a blue sky with the clouds instead of having just be blown out white like an iPhone will perceive it, or even this, and when you don't set it up correctly. So there are a bunch of different ones. There's Cine 1 through 4, HLG 1 through 4, and then S-Logs 2 and 3. S-Log 2 is probably my favorite, just considering what this camera is capable of. It looks almost like black and white when you shoot it. I'll probably have some footage dropped in to show you before and after. And essentially, it gives you far more room to work with the colors of the footage in post. So I can make a heavily stylized video that looks very unique from what I started with, as opposed to my Canon, which does not have any of this. And so basically, the colors look decent. Canon is known for great color science, but it's sort of what you get is what you get. whereas with this camera, you have more room to sort of make it your own. One more thing is low light, which comes back to the sensor sizes. A full frame sensor, essentially, if you have a 24 megapixel sensor, if it's full frame versus APS-C, it's a bigger sensor, so those individual megapixels are going to be farther apart from each other. And so when you do that, you can also make them bigger because you scaled it up. And so you have larger photo sites, which means that the camera actually can perceive more light at once. So you have better low light, meaning when you shoot in the dark, it's suddenly not so dark. It can see more detail, and you can also crank up the sensitivity on the sensor much higher before you start to notice lots of nasty sort of grain and noise in the footage. And Sony is known for being the low light kings of videography, especially with these Alpha series cameras. And this camera is no different. It's fantastic in low light. You have to configure the settings just right or it's not going to look very good in low light, but once you do, it looks great. I definitely love shooting this for both football and lacrosse after the sun goes down. I don't feel like I'm losing too much quality when the sun goes down because, that's the brightest light you have when you're shooting outdoors. So that's definitely it for video quality, but overall, fantastic. Now, some of the cons. First, I'm going to start off with a silly one, which is a lot of people refer to as, your pinky doesn't have a home on the Sonys because they're reasonably compact bodies still. That's kind of been their goal, is to create a pro-level camera that isn't massive like the Canon 1DX. I'll put a photo of that. It's a massive camera. It's like, probably that tall, but like that tall probably. So yeah, it's a massive camera. But the issue with that, though, is those bigger cameras do have nicer grips. And I said the Sony grip was good, and it is good. But I wish it were a little bit taller because basically my pointer finger through ring finger fit perfectly on there, but my pinky, unless I sort of scrunch it up and cram my fingers together, kind of hangs off the bottom. Now, this is more of an issue for photo shooters and video shooters because I don't shoot handheld very much. It's either on a gimbal, which is the crazy thing you've seen me have at the lacrosse games, or on a shoulder rig so that I get sort of smoother shoulder shots, or even on a tripod. But so how the grip feels is less of an issue for me than it would be if I were primarily a photographer, which I'm definitely primarily a videographer. But it is still an issue. But the much bigger issue is the 8-bit 420 100 megabit per second limitations. So they're all slightly different, but they all pertain again to grading footage. Now, I just talked about how you can push it a lot, and then you can create a lot of different looks. There's more room for customization, but there is an upper limit to that. If you start adding too much contrast or too much saturation to the video, you're going to start getting this nasty artifacting, some banding, some grains, some noise in the footage, and it doesn't look great. And this is caused because of a limitation in the amount of data the camera captures. Now, 100 megabits per second, that's the data rate. Essentially, it's the amount of information the camera is outputting from the sensor to the card per second. And a camera that shoots at 500 megabits per second is outputting 5 times the amount of data from the sensor as a 100 megabit per second camera would. This is 100 megabits. It's not bad, but it does definitely handicap some of the features. Like many people online, and I haven't tried S-Log3 too much, but it's even flatter. There's less contrast than S-Log2, so you'd have to push it more in post, and people recommend just staying away from it because when you're trying to push it that much just to get it to look normal and not like black and white, super flat, you're going to end up with a lot of grain and banding. So that is definitely an issue. And some of the competing models don't have quite the same problem. They have a little bit higher bit rates. And then 8-bit versus 10-bit, that's the amount of colors that the camera can support. Essentially, 10-bit, it can recognize more colors. That helps as well. 420, what that is essentially a camera like this, it can't capture the entire file. It's just too big to fit onto any memory card, so it compresses it. It makes the file smaller, and when it does that, it also tends to average out some of the colors. So 420 means in a grid of 4 pixels, essentially, it's going to make all 4 of those pixels, it's going to average them out to one color, instead of recognizing them as 4 unique different colors. That doesn't sound like much, but when you start, when you're working with footage, it's not 4 pixels, but 3840 by 2160 pixels, so massive array. Then you start to sort of notice in the footage those subtle differences. Essentially, the biggest deal is you need more expensive media. It needs to be faster media, so a faster SD card. And then you need a camera that has essentially a more powerful computer inside it to be able to, handle that amount of information at once for both megabits per second and pixel mapping, the 420 sort of thing. So it's very complicated. Essentially, it just means that this camera you need to know its limits when you're color grading and when you're shooting as well. And if you expose the footage properly, these issues can be mitigated, but it's very difficult to expose exactly right, and that's the problem, and that's why I do sometimes get frustrated with this, and why it is definitely on my list of cons. So, final thoughts then. It's the Sony, it's a camera, you need to know its limitations like any camera. And I looked at a bunch of other cameras as well, but I ultimately decided on this one. So I looked at the Canon EOS R, the Nikon Z6, the Panasonic S1, those are all full frame, and then the Panasonic GH5 and the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. Now my issues with those two, the GH5 and Pocket Cinema camera, is they have micro Four Thirds sensors, and we discussed the difference in image sensor sizes before with the APS-C versus full frame, and micro Four Thirds is even smaller than APS-C, so I wanted to upgrade my sensor size, not downgrade. And micro Four Thirds cameras work great for a lot of people, but for me, they do have issues with depth of field. You can get it, many micro Four Thirds fanboys argue, but they objectively do not have as good low light, which was an issue for me, especially since I need something that I can use to shoot lacrosse and football after the sun goes down. So those were eliminated right off the bat. The other one that I eliminated fairly quickly was the Canon EOS R. Now, we discussed cropping in on the sensor like the Sony does at 30 FPS. Well, the Canon does it even at 24 FPS. So no matter what frame rate you shoot at, if you're shooting in 4K, it crops in on the sensor. So your lenses are no longer as wide as they used to be, and it's just generally annoying because I bought a full frame camera because I wanted to shoot full frame 4K. So I was just like that, despite it did have a little bit of a nicer feeling body, and again, it did, the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, the GH5, and the EOS R, they all had higher bit rates. Some shot 444, some 422, more than 420 anyway. Some did 10-bit colors, but at the end of the day, I didn't want a micro Four Thirds, and I didn't want to have to crop it in 4K, which left me with the Panasonic S1, their brand new full frame camera, and the Nikon Z6. Neither one has a great lens selection, and neither does the Canon EOS R, frankly, because they're all brand new full frame cameras that none of these companies have made before. Canon and Nikon are brand new to mirrorless cameras and created a new mount for it, so there aren't very many lenses available yet. And Panasonic is in the same boat with their first full frame camera. So at least with Canon and Nikon, you can adapt to older Canon and Nikon glass for their DSLRs. With Panasonic, you're kind of out of luck. Any of your old micro Four Thirds lenses, which are actually very expensive, will not work on your full frame camera because they're designed for a smaller sensor. And you can put a bigger thing onto a smaller thing, that works. So you can put a full frame lens on a micro Four Thirds camera, but you cannot put a smaller thing on a bigger thing. You can't put a micro Four Thirds lens on a full frame camera. But just they didn't have native lens support. I would have to get an adapter, like a dongle, but for glass, essentially. Where the Sony supports all this stuff natively, so that was an issue. And then the Panasonic was like $500-600 more expensive, and this was already a $2,000 camera. So you add on, end up with like a $26, I forgot, maybe it was even $2,700. I forgot. It was definitely above. I think it's around $2,600 though. But that's significantly more expensive. That's $500-600 more than I paid for this one, and I was like, no way, because at that price, I still don't have any glass, and I needed a little bit left over to buy just 2 cheap lenses even. And a couple of SD cards. So that was definitely a consideration. So I eliminated that for price. It wasn't out yet, and the lens selection was not there, which left me with the Nikon Z6. I came pretty close to actually getting that one. But the issue was, again, lens selection. At least you have the Nikon older lenses for their older DSLRs and film cameras. are still available, but the issue was, like, it had the same features as the Sony. You could shoot an N-Log, which is like S-Log, but you could only do it externally, so you couldn't shoot to your own SD card. You had to buy a separate screen with a hard drive that you mounted on top of the camera. And for a lot of people that works if you're shooting a bigger thing, but I would have, in order to get N-Log and 10-bit and all these nice features that this doesn't even have, out of the box, I would have had to pay an additional $800 at least for an external recorder. So for me, the Sony was the full package. It was good enough, if not the single best in terms of raw specs on the market. But a lot of people said the Nikon versus the Sony wasn't that big of a deal anyway. You weren't getting that much more data to really warrant getting that and dealing with recording externally. So I decided on the Sony just because full package out of the box, best lens selection hands down for native glass, and it was definitely not by no means a bad camera. So I love shooting on this. I will continue to shoot on it for the foreseeable future, and I kind of plan to shoot on it for at least through high school, at the very least, and I would hope to shoot on it for about the next 6 years through college. That's my goal. We'll see what happens. You know, cameras don't last forever. Accidents happen. I'm being very careful with this one, that it's my baby, as I call it, because I paid so much for it. Jesus. But yeah, so I love this camera. I highly recommend it if you have the money to spend on a camera this expensive. I still can't believe I did that. But links below. I buy all my gear from B&H now. B&H is a dedicated camera, audio, video, photo store. So I just felt more confident buying stuff from them, especially a camera like this. So I highly recommend that. That's what's linked below. Amazon will be linked below as well, and to Sony's website directly where you can browse this camera. And thanks for watching this gear review.